Walk into a McDonald's in Tokyo, in Sao Paulo, in a small town in Ohio, or a mall in Dubai, and something strange happens before you've even ordered. You already know more or less what to expect. The shape of the counter, the rhythm of the line, the speed of the wait, the general feel of the place, even if the specific menu items in front of you are different from the ones back home. That sense of instant familiarity, repeated across roughly 45,000 restaurants on nearly every continent, isn't an accident of branding. It's the visible surface of one of the most carefully engineered operating systems in the history of commerce. A system built not around a secret recipe, but around the much harder problem of getting thousands of independently run businesses to reliably reproduce the same experience. At speed, at scale, without the company itself running most of them directly. To understand how that system came to exist, you have to start somewhere most people get slightly wrong, not with Ray Kroc and not with a franchising empire, but with two brothers running a single restaurant in San Bernardino, California, who had never heard of franchising a national chain and weren't trying to build one. Richard and Maurice McDonald opened their restaurant in the 1940s, running a fairly conventional drive-in. Car hops, a broad menu, plates and silverware, the kind of format that was common at the time. It worked well enough, but the brothers noticed something about their own business that most restaurant owners of the era hadn't fully confronted. The format itself was slow, unpredictable and labor-intensive in ways that limited how fast and how consistently food could actually reach a customer. So, in 1948, they did something unusual. They closed the restaurant, stripped the menu down to a small handful of items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, fries, drinks, got rid of the car hops and the sit-down service, and redesigned the entire kitchen around a single goal: eliminate every unnecessary step between an order coming in and food going out the window. They called it the Speedy Service System, and the name undersold how genuinely radical the underlying idea was. Instead of a kitchen where a small number of cooks each handled an entire order from start to finish, the McDonald brothers broke food preparation down into discrete, repeatable steps, laid out in a kitchen designed almost like a small assembly line. One station handled the grill. Another handled the buns, another handled the fries. Each worker performed a narrow set of tasks, over and over, rather than juggling many different tasks across many different orders. This wasn't a novel concept in manufacturing generally. Assembly line thinking had been transforming factories for decades by this point. But applying that logic to a restaurant kitchen, at a moment when most food service still ran on individual craft and improvisation, was a genuine break from how the industry operated. The results were dramatic enough to matter. Orders that used to take a meaningful stretch of time to prepare could now be handed over in a fraction of that time, at a lower cost per item, with far more consistency from one order to the next, because the process itself, not the individual skill of any one cook, was what determined the outcome. The San Bernardino restaurant became locally famous, drew crowds, and started attracting attention from other restaurant operators curious about how the brothers had pulled off numbers that didn't look achievable under the old model. This is the point where it's worth being precise about what the McDonald brothers actually built, because it's easy to collapse this part of the story into something smaller than it was. What they created wasn't a menu, and it wasn't even primarily a building layout. It was a process, a specific, repeatable sequence of tasks, station assignments, and preparation methods that produced a consistent result regardless of which specific person was standing at which specific station on a given day. That distinction between a process and a product is the seed of everything that came afterward, because a great recipe is hard to scale past the person who invented it. But a well-designed process can, in principle, be taught to almost anyone and reproduced almost anywhere. The brothers did try to franchise this system themselves on a limited basis, licensing the format to a modest number of independent operators in the years that followed. But it was a traveling milkshake machine salesman, Ray Kroc, who saw something in that restaurant that went beyond a good regional business. Kroc's actual contribution to this story isn't that he invented the operating system. The McDonald brothers had already built that. And it isn't that he opened the first McDonald's, because he didn't. What Kroc recognized and then pursued with an intensity the brothers themselves hadn't matched was that the speedy service system wasn't just a smart way to run one restaurant. It was a format specifically well-suited to being copied, precisely at a scale far beyond anything the two brothers had attempted, if someone was willing to build the infrastructure needed to enforce that precision across many locations run by many different people. That distinction between having a good system and having a system that can survive being handed to thousands of separate operators without falling apart is the actual hinge of this entire story. And it's worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward, because almost everything McDonald's built over the following decades exists to solve exactly that problem. Franchising itself wasn't a new idea when Kroc got involved. Various businesses had licensed their name and format to independent operators before, but franchising a restaurant format built around speed, consistency, and process discipline created a specific tension that simpler franchise businesses didn't have to deal with in the same way. A franchisee is by definition an independent business owner, someone who has put up their own capital, hired their own staff, and runs the day-to-day operation according to their own judgment. At least in the areas the franchise agreement doesn't explicitly control. That independence is part of what makes franchising attractive to both sides. The franchisee gets to own and profit from a real business, and the parent company gets to expand rapidly, without having to fund and directly manage every single new location itself. But that same independence is exactly what threatens the thing that made the McDonald brothers format valuable in the first place: the reliability of the process. If every franchisee were free to change the grill procedure, adjust the recipe, redesign the kitchen layout, or cut corners on training, the entire value of a recognizable McDonald's experience would erode almost immediately. Because the whole point of the format was that the customer in one city could walk into a McDonald's in a completely different city and get something close to the same thing, solving that tension, getting the benefits of independent ownership and rapid capital-light expansion, without losing the consistency that made the format valuable. Is the actual engineering problem McDonald's spent decades building an answer to piece by piece. The first major piece of that answer was training, formalized eventually into what the company calls Hamburger University. A dedicated training center built specifically to teach franchisees and managers the operating system in enough depth that they could run it correctly without needing constant direct supervision from the parent company. This wasn't simply a class on how to flip a burger. It covered the full operational discipline behind the format: timing, food safety, equipment procedures, staffing structures, customer service standards, and the underlying logic of why each part of the process worked the way it did. So that operators weren't just following instructions blindly, but understood the system well enough to run it correctly under real messy day-to-day conditions a manual alone couldn't fully anticipate. The second major piece was standardized equipment and supplier relationships. And this part of the system is easy to overlook precisely because it's invisible to the customer. A speedy-style kitchen only produces consistent results if the equipment in that kitchen behaves consistently, if a fryer heats to the same temperature, if a grill cooks at the same rate, if the raw ingredients arriving at the back door meet the same specifications, regardless of which city or country the restaurant happens to be in. McDonald's built deep, long-term relationships with equipment manufacturers and food suppliers specifically to guarantee that kind of consistency, working with partners to develop machinery and ingredients engineered around the company's exact process requirements, rather than simply buying generic restaurant equipment off the shelf and hoping individual franchisees could compensate for whatever inconsistencies came with it. This turns suppliers into an extension of the operating system itself, not a separate, arm's-length relationship. but a coordinated part of the same machine designed to produce the same sensory experience, order after order, restaurant after restaurant. The third piece, and arguably the one most often misunderstood, is McDonald's approach to real estate. It's become a popular claim, repeated often enough online that many people treat it as settled fact, that McDonald's is really a real estate company that happens to sell hamburgers. That framing captures something true about the company's structure, but it significantly overstates and distorts it in a way worth correcting directly. What actually happened is more specific and more interesting than a simple property play. For a large share of its franchise restaurants, the conventional franchise arrangement, as opposed to other structures the company also uses in different markets. McDonald's typically secures the land and building itself either through ownership or long-term lease, and then in turn leases that property to the franchisee as part of the overall franchise agreement, alongside the royalty the franchisee pays based on sales. This wasn't primarily conceived as a property investment strategy in the sense of buying real estate, hoping it would appreciate. It was, first and foremost, a mechanism of control. A franchisee who's leasing their restaurant location from McDonald's on a lease tied directly to their compliance with the franchise agreement has a much stronger incentive to maintain the operating standards, cleanliness, and process discipline the whole system depends on. Because losing that lease means losing the restaurant, not simply losing a licensing arrangement. Real estate, in this sense, functions less like a separate business line bolted onto the restaurant company, and more like a lever that reinforces the same consistency the training programs and supplier standards were also built to protect. Another point of leverage the company can use to make sure a franchisee stays aligned with the system, rather than drifting away from it once the initial contract is signed. It's worth being precise here, though, because this arrangement doesn't apply uniformly across every restaurant on Earth, and treating it as a universal rule oversimplifies a genuinely varied global structure. McDonald's operates through several different arrangements depending on the market, conventional franchises where the company typically holds the real estate interest. Company-operated restaurants run directly by McDonald's itself rather than a franchisee, and developmental licensees and affiliates in certain international markets where local partners often provide their own real estate and capital under a different kind of agreement, with McDonald's contributing the brand, the system, and ongoing standards rather than the property itself. Collapsing all of that into McDonald's owns the land under every restaurant, or the company doesn't really care about food, only rent, misrepresents both the diversity of these arrangements and the underlying reason the real estate structure exists in the first place. It wasn't built as a standalone profit center that happened to have a restaurant attached. It grew directly out of the same problem the whole system was designed to solve, which was protecting operating consistency across thousands of independently run locations, with training, supplier standards, and real estate leverage all reinforcing the same underlying discipline. The fourth piece of the puzzle becomes possible: controlled local adaptation. This is another place where the popular version of the McDonald's story tends to oversimplify in the opposite direction from the real estate myth. Instead of assuming the company is secretly something other than a restaurant chain, it assumes the restaurant chain is more rigidly identical everywhere than it actually is. The system was never designed to produce an identical menu and identical operations in every country, and treating any deviation from the American baseline as some kind of departure from the real McDonald's misunderstands what the system was actually built to protect. What the operating model protects is a recognizable experience. The speed, the process discipline, the brand consistency, the underlying quality and food safety standards, not a rigid, unchanging list of specific products. This is why menus vary meaningfully by country and region, sometimes dramatically, incorporating local tastes, dietary norms, and ingredient availability, while the underlying kitchen process, service speed, and operational structure remain recognizably the same format underneath the surface-level differences. A McSpicy paneer in India a rice-based menu item in parts of Asia, or regional variations in beef, chicken, or plant-based options elsewhere. Aren't exceptions that weaken the system. They're evidence that the system was built with enough underlying flexibility, layered on top of a rigid operational core, to be genuinely portable into different cultures and markets, rather than forcing an identical American product onto every country regardless of local demand. This tension between standardization and adaptation runs through the visible evolution of the format as well, not just the menu. The drive-thru, now one of the most recognizable parts of the McDonald's experience in many markets, wasn't part of the original 1948 concept. It emerged later as an additional layer built on top of the existing kitchen process, designed to extend the same underlying speed and consistency logic into a new format of customer interaction, one that didn't require a customer to even step inside the restaurant. Digital ordering, mobile apps, kiosks, and delivery integrations represent the same pattern, repeating decades later. The underlying operational discipline of the speedy system, and everything built to protect it, adapting to new customer behavior and new technology, without abandoning the core logic that made the format work in the first place. Brand consistency operates as the visible signal that ties all of these invisible mechanisms together for the ordinary customer, who never sees the training programs, the supplier contracts, or the real estate leases directly. The golden arches, the consistent visual identity, the recognizable packaging and signage, these function as a kind of promise made to the customer before they've even walked in the door, a signal that says, regardless of what country you're standing in, the operational discipline behind this specific building has been trained, supplied, and structurally reinforced to produce something recognizably similar to what you'd get anywhere else carrying the same symbol. That promise only holds because of everything happening behind the sign, not because of the sign itself. The arches are a symptom of the system working, not the mechanism that makes it work. It would be inaccurate, though, to suggest this system runs without friction or that every part of it aligns perfectly all the time, and it's worth being honest about where the tension between central control and independent ownership actually creates real strain rather than resolving cleanly. Franchisees are independent business owners with their own capital at risk, and their interests don't automatically align with the parent companies on every question. Disputes over royalty structures, required equipment upgrades, marketing contributions, real estate terms, and operational mandates have surfaced periodically throughout the company's history, sometimes escalating into public disagreements or legal disputes between franchisee associations and the corporate parent. The same real estate leverage that reinforces operational discipline can also become a point of genuine conflict when franchisees feel lease terms or renewal conditions are being used to pressure them into decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. And the balance between standardization and local adaptation isn't something the company gets right automatically in every market. It requires constant negotiation between corporate standards teams and local operators. And there are documented cases throughout McDonald's history of menu experiments or format changes that fail to resonate locally, requiring correction after the fact, rather than working perfectly on the first attempt. There's also a structural reality worth acknowledging plainly. A system this dependent on process discipline, supplier consistency, and franchisee compliance is only as strong as the weakest link willing to cut corners. And maintaining quality and safety standards across tens of thousands of independently operated locations, run by different owners with different levels of skill and commitment, is an ongoing operational challenge, rather than a problem the company solved once and never had to revisit. Quality control mechanisms, inspection systems, and enforcement of brand standards exist precisely because consistency at this scale doesn't sustain itself automatically. It has to be actively monitored and enforced, continuously restaurant by restaurant, which is itself an enormous and never fully finished undertaking. What this system produced, by the most recent figures the company has reported, is a footprint of just over 45,000 restaurants worldwide, with roughly 95% of them operated under franchise arrangements rather than run directly by the company itself. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures the actual achievement this story has been describing more precisely than any single anecdote could. The overwhelming majority of the restaurants carrying the golden arches aren't run by McDonald's corporate at all. They're run by independent owners, using their own capital, hiring their own staff, making their own local decisions within a structure carefully built over decades, to make sure that independence doesn't come at the cost of the recognizable experience the whole brand depends on. That's the actual story underneath the burgers and the arches. Two brothers in California figured out that a restaurant could be redesigned as a repeatable process rather than a collection of individual cooking decisions. A milkshake machine salesman recognized that the process built well enough could, in principle, be taught to thousands of independent strangers and still hold together, and what got built in the decades since? The training programs, the supplier relationships, the real estate leverage, the careful balance between global consistency and local adaptation. Wasn't a set of separate businesses stacked on top of a restaurant chain. It was the answer piece by piece to a single, genuinely hard question. How do you build something that can be reproduced faithfully by tens of thousands of people who don't work for you, in places you've never been, without ever writing down a single line of code?